It was the kind of Saturday morning where the Texas sun hadn't yet scorched the air, and little kids could still ride their bikes before the heat chased them indoors. On Bayleaf Circle, folks usually sip iced tea on their porches while sprinklers hissed across manicured lawns. But that calm shattered when an 8-year-old boy's screams ripped through the cold-d-sack. That boy was Jake Rollins, a bright-eyed kid who loved building ramps with his dad and zooming around the neighborhood on his red BMX. His mom, Heather Rollins, had just gone inside to grab lemonade. In that span of 2 minutes, the unthinkable happened. From across the street, a growl shot like lightning through the air, and then the blur of a tan Pitbull bolted through an unlatched gate. The dog's name, Ripper, his owner, a woman who insisted on being called Miss Karen. But her real name was Karen Dillard, the self-appointed queen of the hoverboard and a woman with a temperament just as snappy as her dog. Ripper sank his teeth deep into Jake's leg before anyone could stop him. Heather ran out screaming, nearly dragging the dog off with her bare hands. Blood pooled on the sidewalk as Jake sobbed uncontrollably. By the time animal control arrived, Karen stood on her porch with a margarita in one hand and a smirk on her lips. "He shouldn't have been near my lawn," she called out. Unbothered, Ripper was provoked. Heather's hand shook as she held a towel over Jake's mangled shin. Provoked. He was riding his bike on the street. What kind of monster says that? That day didn't just break Jake's skin. It broke something inside Heather. Something fierce. Something primal. And while Jake was taken into surgery to repair the torn muscle and nerves, Heather vowed something quietly in the back of her mind. Karen wasn't getting away with this. Later that week, a neighborhood meeting was called, mostly by Karen herself, to discuss leash violations and animal safety. She strutted into the clubhouse in her leopard print heels, feigning concern. "Dogs are animals. Accidents happen," she said with crocodile tears. "But if the horror doesn't enforce boundaries, these things will just keep happening." Heather sat in the back row, fists clenched. Her husband, Wes, a quiet man with a dark stare and a background in pest control, leaned in and whispered, "Let her talk. The trap's already baited." Karen had no idea what was coming. That night, Heather posted on the neighborhood app with calm precision, "Since the whore has no interest in protecting our children, we'll be taking our own steps. But don't worry, it'll all be within the rules." What she didn't say was that her husband had just returned from his supply shed with 4 crates of fire ants imported for research purposes. And Karen's backyard, it had a patch of untreated mulch that just so happened to line up perfectly with Hoa property boundaries. Karen Dillard had rules for everything: how tall your grass should be, how many cars could sit in your driveway, and whether a child's laughter was too loud for Saturday mornings. But there was one rule she never followed, her own. Jake Rollins spent 2 days in the hospital after the attack. The doctor said the wounds would heal, but the scars would last a lifetime. Heather didn't cry in front of Jake. She didn't flinch at the sight of the stitches. She waited until nightfall, and then she planned. Their home security footage clearly showed Karen's Pitbull lunging out from her broken gate, and yet, the horror board remained silent. In fact, it was Karen who wrote the latest bulletin herself. All pet owners are reminded to maintain fences and leashes. Those who fail will be subject to escalating fines. As per regulation, this rule will apply retroactively, but not to Karen. Somehow, her fine never showed up in the records. Heather didn't yell. She didn't beg the HOA for fairness. Instead, she called her husband Wes and asked him one simple question: "Do fire ants still build fast in wet mulch?" He just said, "Oh yeah, they thrive." That night, when the street was asleep, Wes rolled out a wheelbarrow of mulch soaked in sugar water. He wore gloves. The buckets looked ordinary, just gardening material to any nosy neighbor. But the truth was darker. The fire ant colonies inside those buckets weren't just any breed. They came from deep in the south, high progressive, with a reputation for building fast and biting hard. Wes had originally acquired them for research, part of a controlled pest behavior study that got shut down due to risk. But Karen's disregard for control gave them new purpose. The next morning, Karen awoke to the sound of chirping birds and sprinklers. She slipped on her fluffy robe, stretched on the patio, and stepped into her yard barefoot. She didn't notice the mounts. Not at first. They looked like part of the soil. But the ants noticed her. Within seconds, her ankles were covered. Then came the bites. Dozens, then hundreds. She screamed loud enough to wake half the street. Ripper barked but didn't approach. Smart dog. Karen bolted through her backyard, flailing, slapping herself, tripping on her own patio stones. The ambulance came 30 minutes later. The whole group chat lit up. All it said was, something bit Karen all over her legs. Paramedics just left. Anyone else seeing bugs in the yard? Heather didn't respond. She just took her son outside, wheeled his bike gently into the driveway, and watched him sit beside her, bandages still on his leg. But Karen didn't blame herself. Instead, she summoned the horror board to her living room the evening. Her legs were swollen, her pride deflated, but her voice still sharp. At one full surveillance on the Rollins yard, they're up to something. Ants don't just show up like that. The board members nodded. And certain, nobody liked Karen, but they feared her. She controlled the bylaws, and somehow, she knew things about everyone. That's when a younger member, Marcus, who'd recently joined the board, cleared his throat. You said ants don't just show up. Right, he asked. Karen snapped. Obviously, well, Marcus tapped his phone. I found something interesting on your security cam backup. Looks like someone did enter your yard. But it wasn't the Rollins. Karen's eyes narrowed. Who? Then, Marcus turned his screen. A blurry figure, hooded, pushing a wheelbarrow. Under moonlight, not a single camera showed their face. But they were efficient, methodical. I suggest you stay quiet, Karen, Marcus said. Because if anyone looks duper, they might find out who's really responsible, and you won't. Like where the trail leads, Karen's mouth hung open. The buzz around Bayleaf Circle wasn't about backyard barbecues anymore. It was about fire ants. And Karen, she hadn't left her home in 3 days. Her legs were blistered, her pride deflated, and her perfect lawn now marked with orange flags from the pest control trucks she'd hired in a panic. But no one pitied her, especially not Heather. Still, Heather knew the ants weren't enough. Not yet. Jake was recovering. But every night he woke screaming from the same nightmare. The dog, the blood, the sound of his own screams echoing in his ears. Heather sat by his bed, whispering, "You're safe now." But she knew the real safety would only come when the fear of Karen was erased from their lives. Across the street, Karen plotted. She watched the security footage over and over, zooming in, slowing down, analyzing every second of the footage Marcus had shown her. No faces, no clear trail. Whoever had done it was careful, almost too careful. That's when she made the call. Not to pest control, not to the horror board. To Daniel Trask, a private investigator she once used during a dispute with a former board member. Trask didn't ask questions, he only asked one thing: what do you need found? Karen replied, I want proof. Someone in this neighborhood is trying to destroy me. Meanwhile, Heather received an unexpected visitor. Marcus. He showed up just after sunset, holding a manila folder and a grocery bag of ice cream. The latter was for Jake, who greeted him with a cautious smile. Heather invited Marcus onto the porch, curiosity burning in her eyes. I wasn't sure if I should tell you this, Marcus began. But I think Karen's onto something. She knows someone did this to her. She just doesn't know who. Heather stayed quiet. Marcus handed her the folder. Inside were copies of HOA financial records. At first glance, they looked normal. Lawn care charges, mailbox repairs, pest control reimbursements. But one set of payments stood out. $3,200 to Southern Canine Legal Defense, paid out of HOA emergency funds. Heather blinked. What is this? Marcus tapped the line. Karen used Hoa money to cover the legal costs for the dog. Animal control was going to take him. But somehow the report disappeared. Now, he's listed as a service companion, protected, so she buried it. Heather whispered. Marcus nodded. And she's done it before. People just don't notice because they're scared of her. Heather stared at the folder. This wasn't just negligence. This was theft, abuse of power. And worst of all, it let that dog walk free. Why are you helping me? She asked quietly. Marcus leaned in. Voice low, because my sister lived here before you. Karen pushed her out. Over a flower bed. She was 6 months pregnant. Heather's jaw clenched. That night, she and Wes went to the garage. There was no fire this time, no ants. But something more powerful was taking root. Truth. And they had the seeds. Back at Karen's home, Trask arrived with a laptop and a smug grin. I ran facial grid tracking, cell analysis, shadow placement. Whoever hit your yard wore soft-soled boots. No tread, military-style gloves, my guess? Someone with a background in tactical pest control. Karen's eyes widened. You're saying this wasn't random. I'm saying it was surgical. But then he paused. One more thing. Trask slid a photo across her granite island. It was of Heather, standing next to Wes, at a hardware store 2 weeks ago. Wes held a bag of sugar mulch in one hand, and a tiny plastic container in the other, one that Trask had zoomed in on. It read, Formicidae, property of Lone Star Invasive Study Division. Karen's fingers dug into the countertop. You want them gone? Trask asked calmly. I can make it happen. She didn't hesitate. Do it. 3 days after Marcus handed Heather the folder, Bayleaf's circle began to change. Neighbors who once nodded politely at Karen now avoided her altogether. Whispered conversations bloomed in driveways. There was a quiet shift, like people holding their breath before a storm. But no one dared say anything out loud. Not yet. Heather stood in her kitchen early one morning, staring out the window while stirring Jake's oatmeal. Wes had gone into town, supposedly to check on the shed. She didn't ask questions. They were both past the point of needing to explain. Jake was healing. He laughed again, even if the limp hadn't gone. But Heather could still see the worry in his eyes when they passed the Dillard house. She could see how his little hands clenched, his bike handles tighter. And that was why she wasn't done. Karen may have been bitten, but Heather wanted something more permanent. Accountability. She and Marcus were working in secret, combing through the horror records, highlighting dates, tracking every shady expenditure. But what Heather didn't know was that while she was digging through Karen's paperwork, Karen was digging through hers. Across the street, Trask parked in front of the Rollins home wearing a delivery vest that read South Parcel. His van looked like any other. He knocked, no answer. Then he circled around back, scanned the yard, snapped photos of the shed, the fence line, even the patch of disturbed earth behind their compost. Later, in Karen's dining room, Trask dropped a new photo on a table. This one showed a shallow patch of dirt that had clearly been dug up and refilled. Karen squinted. You think they buried something? I think you're about to find out. She called in a favor, a man named Gordon, who owed her from a past zoning violation she made disappear. Gordon arrived that night with gloves and a flat blade shovel. Quiet, careful. The moon was thin, and the Rollins backyard was dark. The motion light never tripped. What he found 2 feet down wasn't illegal, but it was personal. A child's torn shirt, Jake's, still blood-stained, wrapped in a sealed plastic bag, alongside it. A color, the same one Ripper had worn, claw, marks and all. And beneath that, a note, we remember, but we don't forgive. Karen's hand trembled when she held the items. This wasn't just a family defending their child. This was war, and she was losing. The next morning, Heather opened her mailbox and found something chilling. An envelope, no return address. Inside was a photo, the same one Trask had taken of her and Wes at the hardware store. On the back, written in ink, careful, some dirt stains don't wash off. Heather's stomach dropped. She ran inside and showed Wes. He didn't flinch. Instead, he nodded. She's finally feeling it. He muttered, good. But Heather wasn't sure it was good. She knew something else now. Karen wasn't backing down. She was escalating. Meanwhile, Marcus received an anonymous tip. A drive left in his mailbox. No label, just a thumb drive sealed in a plastic bag. Curious, he plugged it into his laptop and sat back. The contents stunned him. A full audio recording of a board meeting from a year ago, unedited, raw. Karen's voice rang clear. If that dog hurts anyone, I'll bury it in paperwork so deep animal control won't even know it existed. Another board member replied nervously. Karen, that's not legal. Legal doesn't matter. Control does. Marcus leaned forward, his heart pounding. He had the evidence. Not just shady spending. Not just ignoring the truth. Karen had premeditated the cover-up. And now, she had done it again. That night, Heather's doorbell rang. She opened it to find a single manila envelope on her porch. Inside was the exact same recording Marcus had received. Only this copy included something extra. A second clip. This one recorded 2 nights ago. Karen, speaking to Trask, I don't care what you have to do. Find something, anything, to shut that woman down. You hear me? I want her scared. Heather's breath caught in her chest. That was the moment the line disappeared. This wasn't about horror rules anymore. This was personal. It started with a knock that didn't match the others. Firm. Paused. Firm again. Heather opened the front door to find 2 uniformed deputies standing under the porch light. Both wore blank expressions, but the taller one, Deputy Myers, held a clipboard in one hand and a folded warrant in the other. Mrs. Rollins, he asked. She nodded. Her voice caught in her throat. We've received a complaint involving alleged hazardous materials being stored on your property, Myers said calmly. We're here to ask a few questions. Heather felt the air grow heavy. Wes stepped up behind her. Is this about pesticides? No, sir, Myers replied. We were informed about a possible controlled insect species being released. Highly invasive, possibly dangerous to pets and small animals. Heather blinked. The fire ants. But they hadn't been released. Not technically, just relocated. Wes took a breath. Do you have a warrant? Myers unfolded it without a word. Heather stepped aside as the deputies walked the property, checking the shed, the compost pile, the garden beds. Heather felt the invisible eyes of the neighborhood, watching. Blinds shifted, curtains moved. Karen was somewhere behind glass, grinning into her wine glass. She had made her move. But what Karen didn't know was that the Rollins family had already played theirs. Just hours earlier, Marcus had taken the audio, recording straight to the local news affiliate. The reporter he met was skeptical at first until she heard Karen's voice bragging about burying legal action and manipulating horror control. A story was already in production. It wouldn't air yet, but it was coming, and it would come fast. Back at the Rollins house, the deputies finished their inspection. Nothing dangerous was found, just mulch, compost, garden tools, and sugar, lots of sugar. Ma'am, Deputy Myers finally said, we can't prove any fire ants were planted intentionally. There's no evidence of tampering, and your permits for pest control research are intact. But I'd suggest keeping the soil unbaited. Folks are watching. He tipped his hat and left. Heather shut the door, then laughed, not from relief, from something darker. Karen had sent the law, and the law walked away empty-handed. But Heather, she was just getting started. Across the street, Karen stared at her phone. Refreshing a GPS signal from a tracking app Trask had installed under Wes's truck days ago. She watched him drive to the far end of town, where she assumed he had more ants or more secrets. She didn't trust the horror board anymore. Marcus had grown quiet. Her control was slipping. The other neighbors no longer greeted her, and then her doorbell rang. Karen approached cautiously. She peeked out through the PEEPHOLE. It wasn't the police. It was a woman in her late 40s. Short brown hair, sharp eyes, business casual outfit. She held up a badge that shimmered under the porch light. Department of Agricultural Enforcement. Karen opened the door slowly. Can I help you? The woman didn't smell. Karen Dillard. Yes, I'm Agent Merrill. We received a tip from within your homeowner about tampering with protected animal control procedures. Also possible misuse of association funds connected to an illegal pet certification. Karen's breath caught. I don't. What are you talking about? Agent Merrill opened her folder. Did you authorize HOA payments to Southern Canine Legal Defense for a dog labeled as a service animal despite no documentation? That's a misunderstanding, Karen stammered. It was an emergency fund disbursement. We'll need a copy of your board's financial statements and meeting transcripts. Merrill interrupted. You have 48 hours. If you can't provide them, we'll subpoena. Karen slammed the door shut. For the first time, her hands trembled. That night, Heather and Wes sat on the porch, silent. Then Heather's phone pinged. It was from Marcus. Tomorrow, noon, Channel 5. She won't see it coming. Heather leaned back, watching the moon. Karen had brought investigators, warrants, even a private eye. But the truth, that was coming on airwaves. At exactly 12 o'clock. Every television in Bayleaf Circle flickered to the same local station. It began like any regular segment: morning headlines, local traffic. Then the soft fade-in of an anchor's voice. Up next, a suburban community under fire for what whistleblowers call an abusive horror leader and a cover-up involving a dangerous dog attack. Karen froze. She was still in her bathrobe. Coffee untouched, her blinds only halfway drawn. She dropped the remote. Her hands were already clammy. On screen, they show a child's bike, its red frame twisted at the base of a driveway. Then came a photo of Jake, eyes wide, leg bandaged, bruises peeking from under the gauze. The words "dog attack victim" flashed below. Heather appeared next, standing outside her home. A short clip filmed the day before. We begged the HOA to act after my son was attacked. We got silence. That's when we learned the president of the board paid off the legal case with our dues. Then came the recording. Karen's voice, her exact words, "If that dog hurts anyone, I'll bury it in paperwork so deep animal control won't even know it existed." Every pause, every breath, played in full. No edits. Just her voice, dripping with arrogance. The phones at the whole office lit up like Christmas. Karen's inbox overflowed. She didn't dare open social media. Her name was already trending locally. Posts piled up with hashtags, screenshots of HOA payments, angry comments from other neighborhoods asking if she'd served on their boards, too. But the worst came at 12:20 p.m. A knock on her door. This time, it wasn't a neighbor. It was Agent Merrill, again. And this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a second agent with a body camera and a briefcase. "Miss Dillard," Merrill began, "we're conducting a formal inquiry into misappropriation of funds and obstruction of public safety enforcement." Karen blinked. "You can't just walk in here. You're not under arrest," Merrill replied calmly. "But if you refuse to cooperate, we'll pursue this through federal channels. HOA funds are traceable. Misuse can become a criminal matter." Karen's mouth went dry. She stepped back, holding the door just enough to let them in. Inside, Merrill looked around at the marble counters, the designer furniture, and the spotless glass shelves. All this, HOA paid. Karen said nothing. At the Rollins house, Heather received texts nonstop, support, shock, apologies from neighbors who had looked away. Even some of Karen's closest allies were now messaging Heather directly, swearing they didn't know. Jake watched the replay of the news story from the couch. His eyes stayed wide but calm. "Mom," he said, "did we beat her?" Heather knelt next to him. "We're not done," she whispered. "But now the world sees her, not just us." By evening, the HOA held an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. But for the first time in years, Karen wasn't there. Instead, Marcus stood at the podium. His tie was crooked, his hands shaking slightly, but his voice rang out, effective immediately. "Karen Dillard is suspended from all HOA duties pending investigation." A vote for permanent removal will take place in 48 hours. There were no protests. No debate. Only quiet clapping from the back of the room. One by one, neighbors stood. Heather sat with Wes and Jake, arms crossed, gaze steady. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Karen's kingdom had collapsed in one broadcast. But that night, something happened no one expected. Wes stepped out to check the mailbox just after dark. The street was silent. Porch lights on, cicadas humming. Inside the box was a small package. No return address. Just a handwritten note on the front. For the boy. Wes brought it inside and carefully opened it with a utility knife. Inside, a dog collar. But not Ripper's. This one was new, clean, small. Attached was a name tag, Scout. And beneath that an adoption form. It was signed, approved, already. Processed. Heather blinked. What is this? Jake leaned forward. Eyes wide. Wes picked up the note inside. It said, only for words. He deserves better memories. The following morning, Bayleaf Circle felt different. People were walking their dogs again. Sprinklers returned to their rhythm. Neighbors who once kept their eyes down now waved across yards. It was subtle, but the neighborhood was breathing. Again. At the Rollins house, Jake stood in the front yard with Wes and Heather, holding a red leash. On the other end was a scrappy brown mutt with floppy ears and cautious eyes, Scout. Wes knelt beside him. He's part hound, part mystery, he said. But he's smart, and he's loyal. Jake crouched down, petting Scout behind the ears. The dog didn't flinch, just wagged, slow and steady. Heather kept her gaze across the street. Karen's blinds hadn't moved in over 24 hours. Her front porch light was off. Her trash bins sat untouched at the curb. It was like the house had been abandoned, except she was definitely still inside. Inside Karen's home, the world was darker than it looked from the street. The blinds stayed shut. Her phone had been off since the broadcast. Half her board had resigned. Her inbox overflowed with refund demands. Legal notices had already started arriving. But none of that rattled her as much as the knock she got at 11 a.m. Not the police. Not Agent Merrill. This knock came with a chill. She opened the door slowly and found herself staring into a pair of eyes she hadn't seen in for years. Victor Dillard, her ex-husband. Tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying a worn briefcase. I saw the news, he said flatly, that I'd swing by, see how far you've fallen. Karen stiffened. You have no right. Oh, I do, Victor cut in. You're still using the house we co-owned. And my name's still on the deed. Remember, she pilled. Victor pushed inside like a storm cloud. You always liked running things, but you forgot something. Karen, power means nothing when no one respects you. She snapped. Don't lecture me. I'm not here to talk, Victor interrupted, pulling a manila folder from his case. I'm here to serve papers. I'm taking my name off everything house, accounts, the HOA trust we used to share. Oh, and I forwarded the trust audit to the investigators. Turns out you forged 3 signatures. Karen's face drained. Victor leaned in close. I'd leave before someone opens a case with actual teeth. He walked out without another word. At the clubhouse, Marcus prepared the agenda for the emergency vote. The board had dwindled to 5 members, and the remaining ones, previously silent, now whispered apologies and regret. Heather arrived just before noon. She didn't need to speak. She just sat in the back, arms folded, watching. Marcus stood at the front, per the bylaws. We need a 60% board consensus to formally remove Karen Dillard from her HOA position and ban her from all FUT. Your committee participation, he paused. All those in favor, every hand rose. No hesitation. Karen Dillard, the self-declared queen of Bayleaf Circle, had been dethroned. But just as Marcus closed the vote, an old man in a worn cap raised his hand from the back row. It was Tom Keeler, one of the original founders of the HOA, long since retired, quiet, unassuming, often ignored. I'd like to suggest something else, he said slowly. Everyone turned. I think it's time we dismantle the HOA system entirely, he continued. Rewrite it from scratch. No president, no unchecked power, rotating committee, neighbor elected, no salaries, no legal loopholes. The room buzzed. It wasn't just about removing Karen. It was about cleansing the roots she poisoned. And the idea stuck. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Heather found another envelope on her porch. No name. Inside was a small card. It read, "No ants, no dog bites, no lies. You brought the light back." Someone who watched too long. There was also a key. It belonged to the HOAS original lockbox, the one Karen had kept sealed for years. Wes took it, opened the old filing cabinet in the clubhouse, and what they found made Heather gasp. Records. Real ones. Old ones. The original complaints Karen buried, receipts she never turned in, and letters from neighbors long gone who had begged for help, only to vanish. Now, their words would finally be heard. By the end of the week, Bayleaf Circle had changed. The lawns were still trimmed, the mailboxes still matched, and the fences stood firm. But there was something else in the air now. Openness. Laughter returned. Kids played past sundown. Scout followed Jake down the sidewalks like a quiet protector, trotting loyally behind him wherever he went. Neighbors who once whispered in corners now gathered on porches, talking about real things, honest things, and the horror, it no longer existed. In the form Karen built. At the community clubhouse, Marcus stood with Tom Keeler and a group of volunteers. The original bylaws had been rewritten and voted on unanimously by homeowners. The position of president was dissolved. All power was now spread among rotating, publicly accountable committees. Heather sat in the front row, this time not as an observer, but as a nominated volunteer. Jake sat beside her, still bandaged but brighter. Scout lay under his seat, ears twitching every time the crowd clapped. Marcus stepped forward to speak one final time. "This story started with a lie protected by silence," he said. "But today, we choose transparency. No more closed meetings, no more hidden payments. If it's happening here, everyone knows. And if anyone tries to bring back the old ways," he nodded at the crowd, "you'll stop them, together." The room filled with applause, not the polite kind that Karen used to command, but real applause. And back at the Rollins house, the evening, Wes opened a long-forgotten drawer in the garage. Inside were two sealed plastic containers labeled, in his handwriting, and study, abandoned. He picked them up carefully and walked to the compost pile. Heather joined him silently, holding a jug of water. Together, they poured the containers out and drowned the soil. "Done," Wes said. "Done." Heather echoed. They never spoke about the ants again. But while one story ended quietly, another refused to stay buried. 2 days later, a letter arrived in Heather's mailbox. No stamp, hand-delivered. The handwriting was neat, sharp, precise. "You never met me, but I knew Jake's story before it aired. My daughter lived here. She filed a complaint when Karen's dog bit her 6 years ago. It disappeared. Then she disappeared, moved across the state. Scared out of her home. I've watched Karen bully dozens of families. You were the first to make her stumble, the first to make her fall. The key I left belonged to my daughter. She kept it all this time. Thank you." Heather folded the letter slowly, staring at the signature, D. She tucked it into her desk drawer with the other notes. Silent allies, hidden stories. Justice hadn't come in a grand courtroom. It came through shared truth, quiet persistence, and neighbors no longer afraid to speak. Later that week, as Karen packed the last box into a battered SUV, she looked back at her house for the final time. The shutters were shut, the yard overgrown. The porch light had long burned out. No one came to say goodbye. No one waved. She pulled out of the driveway without fanfare, without a single backward glance. Just the sound of her tires crunching gravel on the way out. Bayleaf Circle didn't need her anymore. It never had. One final vote was cast weeks later, long after Karen was gone. Jake stood in front of the newly planted oak tree at the entrance to the neighborhood. A plaque sat beneath it. For those who were silenced. May your voices never be buried again. The neighbors clapped as Jake cut the ribbon. Scout barked once, proudly. Heather placed her hand on her son's shoulder. You stood tall, she whispered. Now everyone else is standing with you. call to action for viewers and victories aren't loud. They're quiet, steady, and earned through scars. If this story made you feel something about family, about justice, or about standing up when no one else will, don't just scroll past. Share it, because sometimes one voice really can bring down the noise.